So it is customary on occasions such as this to say that it is both an honor and a pleasure to have been invited here, etc., blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, it really is both an honor and an immense pleasure to have been granted this opportunity to speak here in Hegeliana, the indisputable capital of philosophy, and among so many of my masters and friends. Somehow, this is not obscenely, it can be, you can have that at the same time here. So a big thank you to the organizers, the speakers, and all of you who came here for the conference. So some of you might have read a paper I had the good fortune to have translated to Slovenian, which also forms the skeleton of the book I'm currently writing, and out of which I want to present some theoretical problems and some points of cultural political analysis today. In that article, The Emperor's New Nudity, I have argued that there is good reason to think that the particular manifestation of new authoritarian leaders gaining ground across the globe, specifically their capacity to use the violation of unwritten rules as a mode of political legitimation, must have something to do with the transition into a new technological medium, namely the web or the internet. The internet, which began as a promise to radically democratize human communications, a promise to deliver us from the remainders of authority inscribed in the very centralized nature of broadcast, which allows, as it were, for authority figures to speak at us, putting us in the position of passive spectators. Somehow, this decentralizing medium of the internet has come to host and proliferate a culture ridden by conspiracy theories, shaming, and cyberbullying, and a corresponding politics of obscenity, in which this inhibition endows certain politicians with a unique type of aura and authority, quite similar to that which, according to Freud's famed analysis, attaches to the leader of the crowd. Only our crowd behavior, so to speak, is no longer eruptive, but somehow integrated into our daily lives. I've argued that such post-ideological leaders garner their unique aura by means of an act of exposure. Their transgression of unwritten rules is a way to make this usually invisible power palpable, and also pointed out the challenge this poses to our critical operation, which is structured to a large extent around the exposure of power. Now, once we begin to see how such new authoritarian leaders legitimize themselves by making present in their very transgression the unwritten law, an elusive phenomenon and concept which I'm working through, it becomes even more evident the transformation in our modes of writing, our mediation broadly construed, are integral to the story. Now, the notion that these things, new authoritarianism and new media, somehow belong together is embarrassingly obvious. There is no one here who is not well aware of it, and at the same time, I would argue, profoundly puzzling, posing some deep theoretical challenges. Now, why is it puzzling? It is puzzling because in this conjuncture of technology and authority, in terms of mastery, we have two opposing complaints. We complain that we have not yet, and maybe can no longer, master technology. Our instruments have turned against us, and we are dealing here with a slave revolt that we cannot crush. In the words of philosopher of technology Bernard Stiegler, it is an issue of having lost our power over our power. Our means of mastery have turned against us. At the same time, we complain that we have not yet shaken off the shackles of old masters. Indeed, we witness the rise of something which resembles the primordial, mythological, uncastrated father Freud writes about in his infamous Totem and Taboo. There seems to be a short circuit between two opposite tendencies. We get a strong sense that technology is heralding us towards a post-human future. It decentralizes, disrupts, diffuses, and de-individuates, whereas authority, and in particular authoritarianism, seems to be all too human, an atavistic, primordial mode of attachment, firmly rooted in the archaic, mythological past, maybe even our animal nature. Technology leads us towards a desubjectified world, impersonal and hyper-rational to such an extent that it renders human subjectivity outmoded, threatening some of the core essential features of our human subjectivity, ushering a post-human age. Authority, on the other hand, anchors our subjective identification to particular authority figures and seems to be hopelessly primitive and irrational. Somehow, the forward rush and constant disruption of new technologies coincides with the return of the repressed. And so we find ourselves pushed towards a pre-theoretical choice. Either we view the transformation in media technology as fundamental and the political and cultural content of the moment as epiphenomenal, or the other way around. What we are seeing is yet another return of the repressed, and technical media is ultimately but a means of its expression. To mention just two quick examples. For an intelligent philosopher of technology, such as Bernard Stiegler, the story of our moment is about how the dialectics between technological disruptive innovation and its subsequent absorption into culture, the phase in which it becomes second nature, absorbed into the background, is something digital technology no longer permits. For it has made disruption its eternal entelechy, so to speak. One way of grasping this point would be to notice how generations is something which now technology possesses, not culture. We have 2.0, 3.0, etc. for all of our devices and can no longer sustain a relationship between generations in society. For Stiegler, the cultural and political phenomena we observe are epiphenomenal of this fundamental arrhythmia of digital technology we have reached. Nonetheless, he hangs his hopes on law and culture somehow reigning in digital disruption. On the other hand, an intelligent analyst of contemporary global power, such as historian Timothy Snyder, is capable of observing how, while sharing some qualities with both tyranny and totalitarianism, a regime such as Putin's functions, I'm quoting, not by mobilizing society with the help of a single grand vision, as fascist Germany and Italy did, but by demobilizing individuals, assuring them that there are no certainties and no institutions that can be trusted. The Putin regime is imperialist and oligarchic, dependent for its existence on propaganda that claims that all the world is ever such. While these are certainly valuable observations, for Snyder, not only media technology is epiphenomenal, an instrument of propaganda, but because of that very perception, he identifies the nihilism of Russian propaganda with the older generation of passive TV spectators and hangs his hopes on a new generation for whom the web has become second nature to fight for democracy. These are not just parallel arguments, different perspectives. They form a contradiction. It is impossible to reconcile them. So, which is it? Where is the locus of power? So, the wager of my intervention here today is that this contradictory attitude towards mastery might provide us with an opportunity to approach the contradictory nature of mastery as such. So let this be our guiding hypothesis. Technology and authority, their impossible conjunction is the contradiction of mastery. Let me now take a few minutes to develop conceptually the tension between authority and technology. Then I will turn to some ways in which Lacan can help us pose this non-relation more precisely, and in direct correspondence with the technological event of our time, namely the emergence of a computer-networked world. With this, we shall come full circle in order to ask some fundamental questions about the relation between the medium of the web and the cultural contents that plague it. So, first, authority. In a well-known essay, What is Authority?, Arendt approaches the object of her essay, authority, obliquely, making clear right from the beginning that authority is no longer known to us, a thing of the past, felt by us only through the symptoms of its probably fatal crisis. So authority is a thing of the past. This brief formula captures both what is perhaps the most essential feature of authority and the reason of its epistemological unavailability. As we shall see, this unavailability or opacity of authority is a constant, and yet also what underwrites its profound transformation in modernity. Authority and tradition, I argue, form a hermeneutical circle, which in one way, is precisely what has made authority such an elusive concept, and in another way, all there is to know about both terms. So let us begin with the modern epistemological barrier. Definitions of authority rely on a concept of tradition, whereas definitions of tradition rely on a concept of authority. We understand tradition to be that form of life in which authority is or was in full sway, and authority as a mode of power that relies on tradition for its legitimacy. This is why traditional societies are the original object of anthropology, what fascinated moderns about them. Authority at its purest is the authority of a life form, of the unwritten rules of society without recourse to grand mechanisms of control and enforcement such as law and state bureaucracy. Now, Arendt famously argues that authority as a concrete cultural experience was absent from Greek culture, and thus comes to us from the Romans, who then retroactively constitute the Greeks as their, and therefore our, intellectual authorities or forefathers. Western political philosophy in its entirety emerges against this blank, this absence, which therefore could be said to occupy a position somewhat analogous to Heidegger's being, the forgetting of which constitutes Western metaphysics. Our entire political tradition, beginning with Plato and Aristotle, is a massive forgetting of authority. And yet, the origin of authority is not sought by Arendt in the Greeks' own forerunners. She doesn't turn, as Heidegger did, to the pre-Socratics, or as an anthropologist might, to even more traditional societies, but rather to the Greeks' successors, the Romans. Authority is at once primordially lost and somehow secondary, restorative, reactive. It is, as Arendt picks up from the etymology of the word, an act of augmentation, specifically of the foundations, thereby retroactively constituting them as such, as foundational. Authority is nothing but this circularity between establishment and reinforcement. A foundation operates as such, as truly foundational, only insofar as it has to be repeatedly augmented, only as long as we cannot tear it down and erect a new edifice in its stead. It is hollowed ground. Since authority is unapproachable, inaccessible, we might get a better understanding of Arendt's interpretation of it if we follow her strategy and approach it through its very disappearance, by means of that which eclipses it. Significantly, Arendt views the rise of the functional view of society as the other side of the decline of authority. Jump to... nothing is happening. I'm dropping the whole slideshow thing at this moment. Trust me, there are quotes to support what I'm saying. Take it on authority. For her, the fact that we can speak of a function of authority already means that it is utterly lost to us. Although Arendt doesn't quite spell it out, we may offer several different ways in which authority, as it emerges from her essay, is the obverse of the functional. So, number one, if authority is lost once we can speak of it as a function, this is because authority functions to the extent that it is taken for granted, presupposed, operative insofar as it forms the very background of our reality, the groundwork of the world, as Arendt puts it. It is to be taken on trust, implicitly. To view it as a function is the first sign of its malfunctioning, so to speak, the loss of immediacy and transparency. If authority cannot be taken for granted, it cannot be taken at all, would be the idea. In this sense, authority is necessarily veiled. We are not to see behind its curtain. Recall the famous quote attributed to Bismarck, according to which laws and sausages are two things the public should not be made aware of their process of production. The function of authority is mysterious. Indeed, the mystery as to its functioning is the essential ingredient of its unique functionality. This is one way of understanding the importance of ceremony, or what Walter Benjamin called cult value for traditional authority, and hence also the appearance of authority via the medium of crisis. 2, authority does not perform a function. It is profoundly anti-instrumental and cannot be viewed as a means to an end. We know this, although we hardly understand it. Authority is not something to be executed, realized, but a virtual presence that accompanies power, giving it symbolic support. It augments acts and institutions by sanctioning them, permitting them a symbolic entrance into the space of possibility. One could even say that it adds an aura of virtuality, effectively virtualizing the real, making it appear afresh as if a newly individuated being. This is perhaps the key to its distinction from power, as we commonly understand that term. Authority is not something to be enforced. It doesn't hinge on its realized effects. It is more than advice, less than a command, as the famous quote from Mommsen describes it. Authority is superfluous, signatorial, and yet, as such, essential. Keep you in suspense for a second. Authority is substantial. It attaches itself to concrete individuals, a person, a tradition. It is never, as Arendt emphasizes, authority in general. It is rooted or seeks to be so, by no means something transferable and translatable the way a function is. Put in problematic functional terms, it is precisely what endows a person, an institution, or an activity with substance, a dimension of depth, gravity, the density of a substance, maybe something akin to Eric's flesh. Authority belongs to a substantial we. This is point number 4. A pre-individual sense of community, of commitment to our way of life. To view it as a function is to view things from outside, as it were, from a sociological, scientific point of view, which can only conceive of society as a functional construct. Authority, we have already hinted, is directly linked to the mysterious way in which I am inscribed into a given community. It is a view from within a medium of tradition. Hence, Arendt's turn to the particular history she sees herself an heir to, the history of Western political thought. This is also why, in her account, when authority is intact, it brings together freedom and hierarchy. Properly authorized, things are in the right place, so to speak. There is an accepted hierarchy in the original sense, a sacred order. Hierarchy and freedom coincide insofar as I can see my concrete freedom as inseparable from the totality to which I belong. It is, say, as a father that I realize myself, not a liberal formal abstraction. It is an order in which differences between the young and the old, between men and women, between nobles and serfs, have to be accepted and reinforced. Finally, authority is grounded in the law, insofar it is both given and transcendent, a medium in which society is constituted rather than a constituted man-made order. This is what distinguishes it from tyranny, according to Arendt, and I quote, "Even the most draconic authoritarian government is bound by laws. Its acts are tested by a code which was made either not by men at all, as in the case of the law of nature or God's commandments or the Platonic ideas, or at least not by those actually in power. The source of authority in authoritarian government is always a force external and superior to its own power. It is always this source, this external force which transcends the political realm from which authorities derive their authority, that is, their legitimacy, and against which their power can be checked." So the law is operative in it insofar as it is precisely not a function anyone can master. That is precisely insofar as the law has no human author. Arendt's account so far helps us appreciate the extent to which our new authoritarianism is structured as an anti-authoritarianism. If the unwritten law for Arendt is, I would say, as such as unwritten, what serves as the ultimate standard of any authority figure, what are we to make of a Trump or Netanyahu who are precisely capable of attaining authority by means of transgressing these very unwritten laws? Authority, as described by Arendt, is one historically significant way to make the mystery of language, the fact that it is always already precedes us, a medium in which we are individuated, legitimate. The new modality of authority, on the contrary, is premised on the illegitimacy of anything we are called to take on trust. Do your own research is the injunction of the internet conspiracy theorists, their version of Kant's dare to know. The new authoritarian leader appears as the one who exposes the false pretense of established institutions and norms on which we rely. In the classical modality of authority, the figure of authority, say the king, gives body to the unwritten law that authorizes him. He is not its source. In Seminar 2, to which we shall return, Lacan gives this dimension of the law, insofar it is not understood, in his words, a psychoanalytic name, censorship. There's a slide. Lacan makes his point by means of a rather humoristic and strangely current example in which the law forbids us from saying that the King of England is an idiot, under the penalty of death by beheading. Censorship forbids us, that is, from making explicit what everybody knows, that underneath the crown there is a human being just like us, more or less an idiot. He is merely fulfilling a function. The forbidden statement incites much psychic activity in the subject of this King of England, and censorship appears by means of their dreams. Being unable to say that the king is an idiot, the subject dreams that he has his head cut off. This is Lacan. So where are we now? Everyone is allowed, indeed incited, to say that the King of England is an idiot. It even seems to be inscribed into the ceremony of coronation. We all had to watch Charles get annoyed at a pen, like him failing to fulfill his one and only function, to produce a signature. We are ceremoniously anti-ceremonial. Furthermore, we now have kings, authority figures, that ceaselessly display their idiocy, making themselves utterly immune from such ridicule. Not only immune, the more they are mocked, the stronger they get. Has censorship been lifted? Are we no longer under the influence of the unwritten law, the law insofar as it is not understood? Does it no longer have a hold on us? We can mock the king makes a mockery of himself, but we still dream, now more than ever, that our heads were cut off. Our fantasy of being seized by blind mechanisms of power, being headless subjects, is the clearest sign that censorship is more powerful than ever at the very moment it seems to have disappeared. It is within this dream that we need to search for what could be called the censorship of censorship. With this then, let us now turn to look at how philosopher of technology Gilbert Simondon defines the technical mentality and technical being juxtaposed to the rationale of religion like figure to ground. It's gone. Okay, there are quotes. I'll read it. So he describes it as a mode of knowledge sui generis that essentially uses the analogical transfer and the paradigm and founds itself on the discovery of common modes of functioning or of regimes of operation in otherwise different orders of reality that are chosen just as well from the living or the inert as from the human or the non-human. If authority is effaced by the functional view, then it is precisely technology or the technical mentality that does the effacing. Look at the two postulates Simondon offers for the technological mentality, or rather, listen. The subjects are relatively detachable from the whole of which they are part. That's number one. Number two, if one wants to understand a being completely, one must study it by considering it in its entelechy, and not in its inactivity or its static state. If authority belongs to a substantial whole, technology is what tears it apart. If authority is to be grasped as pure virtuality, technology is all about actualization. If authority preserves and sacralizes the past, technology finds its end in the open-ended future. It has to materialize itself in ever more concrete form. Simondon develops a full-blown philosophical account of technical objects, which hinges on the realization of the fundamentally de-essentializing nature of the technical, its pure functionality. To paraphrase Heidegger, Simondon's point can be summed up by the slogan, the essence of technology is nothing essential, or nothing is essential. This is why Simondon conceives of the network, what he has in mind is the power grid, but also communication networks, as the highest realization of the inessential nature of the technical. And so we arrive at our first possible definition of the network from the standpoint of the philosophy of technology. The network is precisely a way to realize, in the dual sense of the term, the part-whole relation in a non-organic, insubstantial way. Neither the part nor the whole are substances, only their reticular relation, whose primary aim is to prevent them from stabilizing into anything resembling the philosophical notion of substance. From substance to network, if you will. Ultimately, for Simondon, the network is the way in which virtuality is actualized as such, paradoxical as this must be. To make this more readily graspable, let us look at how Simondon describes the ideal, i.e. fully realized concrete technical object. The essential lies in this. In order for an object to allow for the development of the technical mentality and to be chosen by it, the object itself needs to be of a reticular structure. If one imagines an object that, instead of being closed, offers parts that are conceived as being as close to indestructible as possible, and others, by contrast, with a very high capacity to adjust each usage, one obtains an open object that can be completed, improved, maintained in the state of perpetual actualities. Okay? Should I ignore this? Okay, nothing is going on here. You're not seeing this. The post-industrial technical object is the unity of two layers of reality, a layer that is as stable and permanent as possible, which adheres to the user and is made to last, and a layer that can be perpetually replaced, changed, renewed, because it is made up of elements that are all similar, impersonal, mass-produced by industry, and distributed by all the networks of exchange. That was long. This is a quite striking description of the smartphone, especially considering its author passed away in 1989. The point is that it is through participation in this network that the technical object always remains, yeah, somewhere. I'll find it at some point.
Okay.
I think maybe don't worry about it. The point is that it is through participation in this network that the technical object always remains contemporary to its use, always new, but we're far away from there. Okay, maybe I don't know. It's very small here, and it doesn't work still. Okay, I guess this is where we are. Okay. Sorry. This is, by the way, kind of makes the point quite perfectly, but we'll get to it. I mean, we're not there yet to the malfunctioning part. The technology is ahead of us. So a perfected technical object is a concrete manifestation of the network, and the network is actualized virtuality, a system for perpetual entelechy. Of course, this leaves out of the question our addictive relation to these little gadgets, the manner in which we enjoy them, and the perverse contents they seem to engender. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. So before we move on to Lacan, let us explicitly address the major theoretical challenge we have here stumbled upon. In speaking about authority, we found ourselves talking about a certain relation to our linguistic being, our being in language, the way it always precedes us and is unknown by us. And while speaking about technology, we were made aware of the radically de-essentializing disruptive effect of technology, perhaps culminating in the medium in which we find ourselves today. When it comes to inquiries about language and media, there seems to be something akin to the famous uncertainty principle in physics we're told we don't understand. The more one focuses on the effects of historically particular technical media, the less one is capable of grasping mediation as such, language, and vice versa. So we might get a little aid here from Marshall McLuhan, the infamous Marshall McLuhan, best known for his oft-quoted and mostly misunderstood slogan, "The medium is the message." Yes, of course. Of course it is. Okay, I'm not reading this, and there's nothing for you to view. Okay, it's there, but it's minutes ago. I'm skipping the quote. You'll have to just take it from me. So McLuhan is not known for the clarity of his argumentation, which I've supposedly you've seen and I've read for you, but we can reconstruct his argument and pick up a few crucial points. The medium is what emerges in the gap between the use of technology, its function, what he calls content, and the message, the way it reshapes our very groundwork, the way we associate and act. The difficulty in studying media, the reason why McLuhan quite rightly argues that we mostly fail to study it, is precisely that the medium is an entity of the gap between our intentional use of things, or intentional activity in general, as a means to an end, which is the viewpoint of technology, but also, mind you, of power, and what happens to us, the way we are in our very activity inscribed in a medium we cannot quite be cognizant of. For our purposes here, what matters is the striking resemblance between McLuhan's account of media and Arendt's analysis of authority. But it also adds a significant twist to it. In itself, the medium is totally transparent, indeed a matter of indifference, and it can only come to view when covered over by content, in its very eclipse, as it were. We need only add, as Lacan does, that this pertains also to our natural language. As Lacan puts it, apropos of the terms we used above of figure and ground, both are, as it were, manifestations of the gap. Quote, "Where is the background? Is it absent? No. Rupture, split, the stroke of the opening makes absence emerge, just as the cry does not stand against a background of silence, but on the contrary makes the silence emerge as silence. The background is not anterior to the discontinuity of the gap, but a product of it. It is only with the cry, something that breaks the silence and stands out as the primordial signifier without a signified, that silence is made present precisely as a dense medium, the palpable presence of the unspoken, the unspeakable. Here, Lacan takes us one important step beyond McLuhan. If indeed the content of a medium is always another medium, as McLuhan argues, then the content of speech, our natural medium, is silence as a medium, the presence of absence or the unconscious. The medium as such, in its purity, is the gap between the lines, so to speak, the erotization of signification, the sense that something lurks in the background behind what is presented to us. What is important to note at this point, however, is the reversal that took place between the functional or technical and authority. Reminiscent of Benjamin's famed opening thesis on history, The Puppet and the Dwarf. In Arendt's account, authority had to veil functionality, above all, its own. Had we known how it works, so to speak, the magic would be gone. And maybe it has. McLuhan offers his intervention at the point in which, on the contrary, functionality is foregrounded, and it is the media effect, the background structuring of our life, that is veiled by it. In traditional authority, the eternal past of times immemorial is sacralized, and change is either absorbed by it or denied. In a technologically mediated environment, change is foregrounded, and preservation of the past loses its internal rationale. And so the repetition that precedes us, so to speak, acquires instead the form of haunting insistence. Differently put, traditional authority is a way to give a legitimate, indeed central cultural place to repression, or primary repression. With modernity, repression is repressed. It is precisely by knowing full well how things function that we are effectively mystified as to their effect on us. Does this not describe equally the reversal in the relation between power and authority? More explicitly than anyone else, Foucault had advanced the notion of technologies of power, often pitted against all the symbolic models of authorization. According to this understanding, the modern modality of power is technological. Power in modern societies has no center and is very much understood as a sort of headless instrumentality, a machine producing effects. Foucault is absolutely right, only that he fails to see the manner in which authority insists, precisely as that which is veiled by the very open, decentralized mechanisms of power. As an essential aside, let us note that with this tension between media and means, we come to one of those precious points where Freud and Hegel are in closest proximity. The dialectics of medium and means is the opening gesture, to the extent there is one, of Hegel's phenomenology, the beginning of the introduction, and it is through it that we get to the mistrust of mistrust, which is where we're trying to get. Psychoanalysis has incorporated McLuhan's insight about mediation and means into most of its core concepts, beginning with the drive. What are the drives if not precisely the enjoyment of the medium? Take the paradigmatic example of thumb-sucking. The oral drive is manifested as an enjoyment of the medium of nourishment, precisely when its functional goal of nourishment is unfulfilled. It is parasitic, secondary to the biological function, but as such, it changes everything, forever colors the way we eat and speak and kiss. From the moment of birth, we cannot effectively separate our normal, goal-oriented functioning from the drive dimension. Without being able to develop it any further here today, we might say that these two conceptual couplets, media and technology, authority and power, are not simply the extensions of men, but the extension of the non-relation between drive enjoyment and our normal, goal-oriented functioning. Okay, this of course has been far from a fully unpacked treatment of these two difficult and challenging topics, authority and technology. What I hope you were able to take from this brief and dense presentation before we move on to Lacan is the philosophical seriousness, so to speak, of the tension between authority and technology, the way they can be seen as representing two polar opposites. Now I move on to argue that it is precisely this tension that allows us to appreciate the privileged position of Lacan as a theorist for our times. From the very beginning, and until the end of his teaching, Lacan was constantly and explicitly struggling to position himself precisely in light of this tension. Psychoanalysis, as he understood it, is a technique with serious, deep commitments to science, one indeed that Lacan does much to formalize, and yet it has an author, and one Lacan sees himself committed to augment, to borrow Arendt's language. In the little time I have left, I will pick up on a few points from an early seminar, Seminar 2. Famously, the seminar includes a standalone lecture given by Lacan on psychoanalysis and cybernetics. For our purposes here, suffice it to say that cybernetics is now largely acknowledged to have been the intellectual source not only of many foundational inventions in the fields of information and computation, but also in the theoretical cornerstones of cognitive science, the notion of DNA, and the project of artificial life and artificial intelligence. It springs from the theoretical consequences drawn from the possibility to engineer a self-regulating or self-correcting mechanism, the self-guiding missile. If a mechanism can interact with its surroundings by means of a feedback system, the ontological divide separating the living from the inanimate is shaken to its core. As intelligent commentators have noted, the functional or analogous perspective analyzed by Simondon as the de-essentializing core of technology here reaches a certain apex, a crucial moment of which is the analogy of informational systems and physical ones. It is not only that we can draw analogies between self-guiding mechanisms and animals, thereby calling into question the metaphysical uniqueness of life, we can now detect a profound analogy between language and nature. With this, let us turn to a quote by which Lacan articulates what he takes to be the common ground of cybernetics and psychoanalysis. Why are we so astonished by these machines? It may have something to do with the difficulties Freud encountered, because cybernetics also stems from a reaction of astonishment at rediscovering that this human language works almost by itself, seemingly to outwit us. Both cybernetics and psychoanalysis stem from the astonishment that human language presents itself as working by itself, almost. Of course, what will advance Lacan's thinking here is what looks like rhetorical flourishes, the almost, which allows one to pay attention rather to its malfunctions, and the way such an encounter with language seems designed to outwit us. That is, the game of temptation and deception integral to our being in language, its erotic dimension. One way to condense the lesson emerging from Lacan in this seminar and subsequent ones is to say that science and authority are divided by a common object, for which I propose the catchy name of a knowledge without knowers, yet another name for the unwritten law. Notions like structure, system, network are ways to describe a phenomenon that behaves as if it was purposively organized, as if it knew what it was doing. Even if we suspend or even preclude the possibility of their intelligent design by an external subject, that is the notion of an author, the word self seems to impose itself in their description. They are self-organizing, self-regulating, etc. Only they do not have a self, or do they? As a first approximation, and this is very problematic, we could say that authority, as understood by Lacan, is a way to view this knowledge without knowers from within, as something we are primordially entangled in, caught in the web, as it were, whereas technoscience is a way to view it from without. As to the first, consider the following definition of the unconscious proposed by Lacan in the same seminar, Seminar 2. The unconscious is the discourse of the other, not the discourse of the abstract other, the other in the dyad, of my correspondent, nor even my slave. It is the discourse of the circuit in which I am integrated. I am one of its links. It is the discourse of my father, for instance, insofar as my father made mistakes which I am absolutely condemned to reproduce. Note that the discourse of the father, the inscription in a chain of tradition, is already presented by Lacan as one way in which one may be inscribed within the network of signifiers, one way in which we might inscribe ourselves in language, one way to subjectify the fact that everything is always there. It is precisely Lacan's functionalization of language, him viewing it as a network, that allows him later in Seminar 11 to condense the primary inscription within a network of signifiers, or primary repression, with the formula, a signifier represents the subject to another signifier, which he will never tire of repeating. He was justifiably proud of it. It captures the co-emergence of a split subject or a subject of the unconscious and a quasi-totalized network, a language that almost functions by itself. and also captures the erotic nature of our inscription within a network, the troubled relation we have with what supports us in the symbolic. The master as a signifier that incites us into language by its very mysterious nature, suggesting to us that somewhere behind our backs, as it were, lies the knowledge we are missing, the knowledge that would make us whole. Lacan's functional formalization will also allow him, in Seminar 17, to consider the possibility that this fundamental function of signification, which initiates us into language, can be fulfilled by what I earlier called a knowledge without knowers. Somehow, this knowledge without knowers, precisely as a process of unveiling, can function as its own veil, so to speak. At the same time, Lacan is acutely aware of the ways in which electronic, indeed digital media, which he sees as a realization or materialization of the symbolic, alters in a fundamental way our native inscription within language. Here, he emerges as an indispensable resource to think about the technologically realized network, the internet. In his aforementioned lecture on cybernetics and psychoanalysis, Lacan presents the function of the symbolic, as he will do again and again, with reference to the door. As he puts it in the lecture, what makes the door symbolic is that, I quote, there is an asymmetry between the opening and the closing. The door is a real symbol, the symbol par excellence, that symbol in which man is passing. We can read this as a condensed version of themes that Lacan will later elaborate. Our entrance to the symbolic has to do with it being more closed than open, so to speak. The way in which it's closing is what makes the idea of an opening alluring. And yet, something in the emerging technology, which makes the game of presence and absence into its prime operator, seems to transfer the symbolic from the terrain of the human sciences, which he calls the science of conjecture, into the realm of technoscience, thereby altering it radically. And I quote again, once it has become possible to construct an enclosure, that is to say a circuit, so that something passes when it is closed and doesn't when it is open, that is when the science of the conjuncture passes into the realm of realization of cybernetics. There is much to be said about this dense paragraph and the lecture to which it belongs, but for now let us only take from it another possible definition of the network. A network is that which opens by closing and closes by opening. In that respect, the web is structured like the unconscious. Imagine there are quotes to speak to that. In Seminar 11, that's how Lacan speaks about the unconscious. It is structured, so to speak, around its absent boundary, incorporating it. And this is also perhaps why its social content, to bastardize McLuhan's terminology, is the social as a network. It veils its nature, so to speak, by displaying content that reveals it. The new figure of authority that we are all witnessing emerge has a similar structure. Its gesture of unmasking the veils of authority is its very mask. It is a commonplace observation that a medium becomes what it is, so to speak, reaching its self-reflectivity with the emergence of a new medium. The camera, capturing precisely by being a superior technology, better equipped to capture reality, made painting aware of itself as a medium, propelling painting into what we today call modernism, the exploration of its means of expression, of color, shape, etc. We all know this. As my friend Noam Yoran has pointed out, the internet reveals to us what broadcast was. It was essentially a medium drawing a sharp ontological line between being in it, say being on television, and watching it from outside. This is why, by the way, the self-reflective moment is to be found in reality TV, not high art like in painting. The network, on the contrary, has no proper inside nor a proper outside. Its lack of interiority is made clear when we consider, for instance, that the mark of a true internet celebrity or event is precisely its spilling over into old media, being reported about in television and newspapers, what many today call legacy media, and which we predominantly consume, if at all, via the internet. With Lacan, we might say to be in the circuit is to be outside of it. For that very reason, one is also never quite outside the network. Like a rumor, referencing Mladen's beautiful paper on that, What goes on online, namely on social networks, has a way of getting to us even if we do not actively participate. If not old media, someone will surely eventually tell us about it, unless we go off the grid, cut ourselves off civilization. The internet as a medium is organized around this very problematic. We might say that both platforms and algorithms, say the machinery of the internet and its users, are inescapably asking themselves what is it to be in a network. They are asking this in their practice, of course, not explicitly. The reason why there must be social networks in the plural is that each platform proposes a specific answer to this paradoxical being. Certainly, social networks are business ventures aiming to make a profit, but in order to do so, they need to offer a new way of being in the network. And while what distinguishes one social network from the other is precisely the unique answer to that question, they all share this one feature of oscillation. We oscillate between being outside of them, incapable of getting in, or inside, incapable of getting out. The infamous addictive character of social networks has everything to do with this erotic dimension. Anyone who has ever dipped his toes, so to speak, into a new social network can attest to this experience. At first, one is seduced and repelled precisely by the experience of being an outsider. There are unwritten rules, some social, some technical, that make it hard to become an insider. Other people will tell you, you only get it once you have so many followers in Twitter, or once you have given this much opportunity for the algorithm to study your embarrassing unconscious preferences, TikTok. After a certain imperceptible threshold is crossed, you haven't arrived, but you are caught. All of a sudden, it's hard to get out. One simple way in which TV reveals itself as a medium is when we turn it on in the background. Can one turn on the internet in the background? Clearly not, which goes to show that we can never turn it off. This feature of the web, always lurking in the background, never quite there, is incarnated by the new social type produced by the internet, the creep. If, as Foucault teaches us, the figure of the sinner mutated in disciplinary societies in the figure of the pervert, then certainly in our age, the pervert has mutated into the creep, lurking in the background. Lurking, I recently learned, is the way passive spectators on social networks, such as myself, are described. Their suspected presence creeping everybody out. Those who cannot seem to manage to make an entrance, no doubt out of fear of creeping everybody out, serve the function of making the strange, absent presence of the network appear. The political polarization of internet culture between right-wing trolls who get a kick out of offending the sensibilities of progressives, who in their turn get a kick out of being outraged by the trolls' transgressivity, expresses on the level of content the formal truth of the medium. It is precisely because of the felt absence of a solid symbolic space in the sense developed by Arendt that social boundaries need to be constantly transgressed and regimented. Paradoxically, we feel the pressure of the unwritten law ever more acutely, ever more confusing, the more we try to exercise it and render it explicit. Can these features of the network illuminate the new type of authoritarianism everywhere on the rise? As an empirical statement of fact, new authoritarian leaders seem to be masters of new media. Trump was the president of Twitter, and anyone who follows Israeli politics cannot fail to note that Netanyahu has now become the TikTok candidate. Should this be written off as an effective propaganda, a more effective manipulation of the medium? The hypothesis I'm advancing suggests a more substantive relation here. What is unique about the charisma of such figures of power is the way they lie by means of an act of exposure. They fascinate by their very capacity to transgress the unwritten law. In this sense, the conspiracy theorists who support them are closer to the truth than outside observers. Their dear leaders do indeed uncover a secret power that lurks in the background, out of sight. Only that power has no center, no author, and no substance until it is transgressed. That's it.
Thank Thank you, Yuval, for this really comprehensive and brilliant exposition of many problems. I'm sure that we should discuss, or could discuss this for hours and days, because it's so rich in developments, and I really mean it. So we have now maybe 5-10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I have to be clock master. So, are there any questions?
I think it's all clear.
Yeah, crystal clear. Yeah, there's Aaron back there. But it's what?
It's a little bit unfair question.
That's my favorite kind.
Look, I just want to zoom in on one thing you said. I mean, because this talk was really rich, and I'm going to ignore actually everything you said about technology. I was really curious about one. So at one point, you make a claim. You raised the famous example of thumb sucking in Freud, and you said, I don't think I quite followed this. You said that the problem of authority and power and the relation to technology can be situated in the tension between instrumental goal-oriented behavior and the drive, this kind of autoerotic drive. There was some claim there that I thought was really crucial, but I thought I kind of missed. And I just wanted to say, you know, for me, so if you wanted to think of authority from a psychoanalytic perspective, you would need to add a third element, neither the instrumental behavior nor the drive, but you would need the aspect of desire. So it's neither the child who eats because it's hungry or the pleasure and the sucking that can articulate itself in all sorts of objects and relations and kind of is in a dialectic between adhesiveness and plasticity, what it gets fixated on, and its creativity. But you would need a third element, which is precisely, it's the mother that's feeding me. And if the mother feeds me, that's a sign that she loves me, that I'm attached to that mother, and that I have some kind of relation in which the mother is authoritative over my existence. I mean, this is actually, the author you find is Elias Canetti, who says the very first paradigm of power is the mother that feeds. So that's what I kind of missed, because if I understood, you wanted to situate the problem of authority in a tension between these two elements, but actually in psychoanalysis, you could think drive is always a way, in a sense, out of the problem of authority, because it's indifferent in some sense to the other.
Okay, so I'll begin with the easy part, which is to say that I disagree. I think that the idea of attachment to the mother complicates things unnecessarily here. I'll begin anecdotally. When my first son was born, the first thing he met was my finger. That was the first object that he sucked on. And you could just see this immediate...
Yeah, well, okay, that's... Okay, sorry.
No.
Go on.
The point being...
Same here, let's say.
The point being that you can see immediately when a young child is born, this weird satisfaction when nourishment is not there. Mm-hmm. So I don't think, not that it's not an important part of our psychic lives, but it's not an important part for this element of the theory. I think that the more important or the more interesting fact here is just that it's there from the beginning somehow. And I mean, this is, Alenka wrote an entire book about the complication of how to the non-relation, let's say, between drive sexuality and reproductive sexuality. And I think, for me, the short answer would be that the third element is that non-relation. And if you're not satisfied with that, I'm happy. No. I leave
that would be an interesting debate to go further, but it really, that's interesting. You can't derive authority from out of that, I don't think.
Okay, and just, again, the short answer, this is the part I said I'm not going to go into. The reason is I don't have prepared answers. I have some initial thoughts that I can share them, but I don't know that this would be any more satisfying. I mean, I identify a certain terrain here, might be wrong, but it's not like I have this fully worked out, this part of it.
Arthur.
Thanks very much. That was a fantastic paper. I just have a really simple question. I was so pleased to see you talking about Seminar 2, which I think is a great and underread seminar. And the master-slave dialectic is all over Seminar 2 in different ways. You mentioned one of the passages there. There's that great bit where he talks about when man realized that if you don't feed a slave, it will die, that's when you realize that a slave is a kind of a machine with an input-output ratio. And in the essay, the psychoanalysis and cybernetics essay, he talks about the birth of modern science and the order of science. Man realizes that I'm not master of nature, I actually have to be the slave of nature, and the only way in which I can sort of remaster nature is by being the best slave possible, by serving it as well as I possibly can. I'm just wondering, what do you think is going on there? I mean, why do you think he returns? I mean, I know obviously this is a huge topic in Lacan generally, but in that specific context of cybernetics, what are the political stakes maybe of the master-slave?
Okay, thank you for that question. First, just as a note, I think part of the reason that it's not a very popular seminar, or it is popular among people interested in media, cybernetics, stuff like that, less so in pure theory, because, Lacan is not yet at his zenith there, and that makes sense. I'm interested in the fact that this tension sort of haunts his work, and I think that makes him somehow, you can see where these things begin and how they develop. So that's to that, but to the substance of your question, again, I'm just sort of putting it out there. I think this is a very important part of the lecture, is this idea of what I think through the terms of Walter Benjamin is first technology and second technology, right? Because he speaks in the first part about ceremonial way of engaging or symbolic exchange with nature and the way this breaks off. And yes, this is something that interests me greatly, and I don't know that I've expanded now, yeah.
There are 4 questions now. I'm very sorry, I can't, it's simply this light is killing me because I didn't see Henrik there. So Simon, Jamal, and then Henrik, and there's
Thank you, Yuval. This was great. I have just a quick remark on the exchange that you had with Aaron. One memorable passage in Seminar 11 is when Lacan talks about the breast, and what he pins down there is he compares the breast to vampires sucking, the mother's body. So I would say it's not that the mother has authority over me, as Aaron suggested. It's the breast that has authority over her, and this is how the child encounters authority. It's the partial object that has authority, like this totally asubjective entity has authority over the other. This is how authority is met by the child. So this is just perhaps you have some thoughts on that.
Quickly, for me, just bringing together these 2 huge topics of, technology, the problem of this idea of mastery over nature and the failures of it, and the other idea of mastery in social relations, bringing them together is where you meet complications like that. Just to give you a taste of what I'm thinking about, is that one thing that we take for granted is this distinction between object and subject. We think that's a given. But if you go into, and I'm interested in that, in what first technology could mean, then the divide is there, but it is spread out differently, right? You can find subjectivity, this is the entire point, in objects and in other non-human things. So for me, part of the story is how a certain transformation in human relations changes this fundamental relation to nature, and then that's where I just don't take that for granted in that sense, that I know in the beginning what object there is in subject. I don't know.
Okay, just 2 very, very quick answers and very, very quick questions and answers. I'm just tired.
Yeah, sorry, very briefly, and I have to distract you from Lacan. My question...
Please do.
So, and also, I missed the very beginning of your talk, so I guess that this is where you were
all
grounding
there.
on the
definition.
definition.
It was all there, all the questions to your answer.
No, but like the notion of authority, I understood like that it was from Arendt that you took the definition of
Yes.
authority.
Yes.
But then everything else I listened to, like I was wondering why not the notion of influence, not only related to influencer, because of course you were talking about media, but I mean the authority of knowledge, and to me, from what I heard, it was much more about influence and communication. But probably I missed a lot of the premises that where you define when you define authority and knowledge as the two key concepts.
No, it's not completely misplaced, but I get just as like what I take from Arendt to be significant, I mean many things, but in one sense is this idea that, what does it need for authority to be taken for granted somehow? What makes it falter? And what I try to trace is the way that functionality and authority sort of switch places. There's a moment where that happens. And that's why this juxtaposition was important to me. Again, I don't know that I even understand really naively what influence means.
Like an influencer. What an influencer is.
Influencer in that sense. Okay. I
We'll discuss this later.
Okay.
Just quickly,
sorry. I misunderstood your question.
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
I'm
Just
not sure if
quickly,
I can do it very quickly, but
just do it.
I have
Tell
two
us more
questions.
about how quickly you can do it.
Pressing us. Sorry.
One is too small and the other is too big. But the first is you mentioned that generations is something that belongs to technology now, but there's surely this kind of obsession with generations now, especially on new media. So something exemplified by this "okay, boomer" idea, right? We're generationalizing ourselves. And the second is that maybe you can flip McLuhan's formula and say that the message is a medium based on kind of reading from what you were saying. And well, this is far too long, but the fact that the network is essentially open has this formal aspect to it, that it has the form of life. And in that kind of implies a fantasy of authority in the same way that a formula implies the fantasy of the meta-language, and kind of bringing in some fantasy of a big other. But this is far too vague and big.
Quickly, I don't think that it's open. I don't think that was my point. I think that what open and closed are sort of shifts. And I was just trying to make, Stigler is a difficult theorist, but I was trying to make sort of a quick way into what I take to be his primary point, which is again that what we all sort of know this, that one way in which generations are really defined is this adjustment to new technology, this way of absorbing something new into the background. Benjamin writes about it beautifully, that every generation brings into his second nature new technologies, and his point is, and I think it should not be dismissed, that this is over. This game is over somehow. We can never catch up. And so I was just trying to make that quickly.
Yeah, sorry everybody for cutting up the discussion. Thank you again, Yuval.
Thank you.